see only by the fact it's raining that I don't come to you with dirt under my fingernails today, because we are right in the middle of our fall tree planting and trying to get that wrapped up in the next week. Well, thanks for having me out today. My main purpose today is to tell you a little bit about why partnering with different people in our community and different organizations in our community is so important to Greenlawn Cemetery, and how much we appreciate those partnerships and the benefit that they bring to Greenlawn. But to do that, I need to tell you a little bit about the cemetery first. So we'll start there. We will start here. So Greenlawn Cemetery has been around for about 175 years. We are the second largest cemetery in Ohio with over 155,000 interments. We have about 80 acres of open land left, so we expect to continue to be an active cemetery and sell spaces for potentially another 100 years, which is an important part of our story, that we still have a lot of life left. We are an active cemetery. In addition to that, we are also a few other things. We're an arboretum. We're also an Audubon important bird area. And we mean a lot of things to a lot of other people as well. The start of Greenlawn came into early in the city's history. By the early 1800s, Columbus had two main cemeteries: the Old North Cemetery, which is where the North Market is today. There we go, point that out. And the Franklinton Cemetery, which was the original pioneer cemetery for the village of Franklinton. Both of these older cemeteries had some problems, and they were essentially the same problems. They were both in the floodplain, very close to the river, which was also our water source. They were both kind of centrally located, which we had folks dying from these contagious diseases like cholera and typhoid, and we were bringing them into the center of the city to bury them, and that maybe wasn't the best idea. And probably the biggest problem with both of them that made it a crisis was they were out of space. They were landlocked by the river, by new buildings, in the case of the North Cemetery, by the railroads. They didn't have room to grow anymore. The other problem that the citizens of Columbus by the 1830s and 40s had with these cemeteries is that they no longer fit people's expectations in a cemetery. Prior to this time, death was viewed a little bit differently by society as a whole. It was something to be feared, to be approached trembling, awaiting your judgment. And cemeteries of that period generally reflected that. They were fairly stark, fairly unadorned burying grounds. By the early 1800s, the Romantic era in the arts had started to influence society's attitudes about death and their expectations for cemeteries. And death was come to be seen as something a little more natural, something that would be approached more peacefully, and you wanted your burying ground to be more than just a stark pauper's field, but to be someplace that was a little more natural, a little more green, a little more peaceful for your afterlife. And there are some couple great quotes that I'll read that kind of get the idea of what they were going for. One is by the landscape architect that designed Greenlawn Cemetery, Howard Daniels. He wrote, "The rural cemetery is a peculiarly American institution whose presence in large cities paves the way for the next great step in rural progress, providing public gardens and parks for the people." Kind of intuiting that these rural cemeteries were more than just burying grounds. And then from the book Our Town by Ohioan Helen Hooven, "A labyrinth of drives winds in and out among the headstones and monuments. Here and there a weeping willow tree or a flowering shrub ornaments some family lot. On and between the graves the grass grows thick and green, over all are the trees. Once upon a time chestnuts, and still maples and that great trinity of oak, ash, and elm." So they're describing something very different from the early burying grounds in Columbus and the United States, something very much more park-like. And it would not have been uncommon during that time period to come out to the cemetery with your family several times a year, go to your family lot, clear it of any overgrown brush, cut the grass, clean it up, straighten, stand up any markers that might have fallen over, have a picnic, and then take your buggy or just walk along the pathways through the cemetery, look at the birds, just enjoy nature. And of course, many of that stuff still occurs at Greenlawn today. But to appreciate the rest of the story, I have to get you a little bit familiar with, on a very simple level, some of the challenges that cemeteries face. And so if you imagine the economics of a cemetery, the first challenge is this. How long do we expect our burial grounds and our graves to last? Forever, right? So you have something you're establishing in a fairly short period of time, over 100 years, over 200 years, over 300 years, that you expect to last for thousands of years. So that's one challenge. How do you do that? The second challenge is kind of in the day-to-day economics of a cemetery. So this picture represents approximately the original 84 acres of Greenlawn Cemetery. There's a lot of white space, which is just undeveloped land awaiting being put into production. And then there's some green space, and that represents at that time what some of the active gardens were, the places where they were actively selling spaces and burying people. So you have the green producing a revenue income that supported the maintenance and everything going on at the cemetery, and you didn't have a lot of extra expense outside of what you were actually putting into the business. Well, by around 1900, the picture changes a bit. You still have some undeveloped white space. You have approximately the same number of gardens still producing revenue that are active and where you're doing most of your sales on a day-to-day basis. It's a little bigger because the city has grown a little bit by now, but it's not that much bigger because there's also some other cemeteries starting to be established in central Ohio. But the big addition is that big red area. These are the gardens that you've already essentially filled up in your first 40, 50, 60 years. Those gardens aren't sitting there idly. You have to maintain them. You have grass to cut, you have a road network to maintain, fencing, you may have some buildings in there that need roofs, that need utilities, you have security. So the business model is a little rough because the more successful you are and the longer you last, the more revenue you have to produce to support all of this product that you've already sold and is no longer doing very much for you in terms of revenue. And as we get to today, again, the city has grown, but there's also more cemeteries. So you do have a little more area in production in terms of acreage, but not as much as you might expect. But you have this tremendous amount of gardens that were sold over the last 175 years, and about 27 miles of road network that need to be maintained, 3.5 miles of fence, 30 buildings. It's a big project, and of course security and grass cutting over all of that. And still being produced by essentially about the same amount of active acreage. So it's a tough business model. And ultimately, the business ends when you're sold out of spaces. There's nothing left to sell at the cemetery, so there's no revenue coming in to maintain or support anything that you've built. So how do you, now you have 360 acres, and it has all these roads, all these headstones, all these buildings, it still needs security, you still need to cut the grass. How do you maintain that without any sales revenue coming in? And for a long time, there was not a satisfactory answer to this. In the past, you relied upon the Cemetery Association to invest in the property, develop the property, take care of everything that needed to be done, and be wise enough and successful enough to simply build up a savings account as a retirement fund for the cemetery. Many, many cemeteries did not do a good job of this. That's why you have so many cemeteries that are in trouble today, or that are abandoned, or that are now parking lots, or run by a municipal organization and not by a cemetery association or a church. It's tough to get to this point. Now, over the last several decades, there's a law where 10% of all the land you sell goes into an endowment care fund, and that becomes a statutory retirement fund for the cemetery. And so that is how you have to try to make this happen. It's a rough model for a cemetery that's 175 years because essentially we are the person who didn't save for retirement in our 20s and 30s and 40s before the law established these endowment care funds. And now we're 45, or now we're 50 years old, and we've only been saving for retirement for 5 years. We're in catch-up mode. And again, a lot of older cemeteries, that's the boat they're in. The good news for Greenlawn is that we have a lot of life left in us, so that is not a crisis for us. But it is something we have to be cognizant of and we have to plan for and work towards. So the way the money comes into the cemetery, when you're a brand new cemetery, you have sales coming in, and originally this wasn't the case, but now you have 10% of those sales going into an endowment care fund. You don't have a lot of endowment build up when you're a new cemetery. You don't have a lot of donations going because you don't have that many families invested in the property yet. But as time goes by, your endowment starts to grow, you start to get a little bit of income off of that, and you start to build up some heritage, and you get some families and some donation programs coming in. And your sales stay strong through this period. As the cemetery enters its last couple decades of life, now it has less inventory to sell, probably less variety of inventory available, so sales will start to decrease when you get to the end of your property. And then you're counting on your endowment to be able to pick the slack up and your donations to be able to pick the slack up until eventually you're out of inventory, and that endowment must be sufficient to maintain the cemetery forever. The math is not that hard. You figure that there's about 1,000 spaces that you can get per acre. For a cemetery like Greenlawn, you need about $100,000 per acre in your endowment in order to maintain the cemetery minimally. The best goal would be to double that, but minimally maintain the cemetery, you need $100,000 per acre. So you know that spaces must sell for no less than $1,000. Now, of course, this would be assuming that you were starting a brand new cemetery with the endowment care fund law in place. Not the case with older cemeteries. So again, we have to adjust this math on how much land we have left, how many spaces that equates, and what does that need to generate to get the endowment care fund to where it needs to go. Basically, right now, Greenlawn Cemetery is probably running about 20 or 25% of where it needs to be before it retires. Again, we have 100 years left, so we're in good position to catch up and be in good shape on that. But it is something that we have to pay attention to. The consequences of not doing so are pretty severe. Your cemetery won't be maintained. You'll be late. You won't have staff. You won't have money to keep the grass cut. It'll become overgrown. Broken monuments won't be repaired. Your cemetery will go into disuse. Best case scenario, the city or the county takes it over. Worst case scenario, it becomes the parking lot for the North Market. So these things all have to factor together, and you have to figure out, how do you solve this equation, and how do you maximize your chances for being a successful cemetery that does last forever and meets the customer's expectations. And a lot of feeds into that is first of all, having that business sense of how cemeteries work and what makes a successful cemetery, not just in the short term for the people working and selling there today, but also for the long-term goal of the cemetery to memorialize and remember our heritage and our families forever. The other piece of it is how do you maximize the building of that retirement fund? Can you put extra percentage from sales in? Yes, it's tough, and most of you are involved in businesses and know that that's a great idea, but it's not always easy to balance your daily sheet when you start doing that. You can also minimize and try to leave as much income coming in from the endowment in it to roll over as possible. Again, you get a tight year, it's awful tempting to take some of that income off. That's sometimes easier said than done. You can also raise donations and partner with grants and community projects, bring other things. We sometimes do weddings in the cemetery. We'll rent out the chapel for meetings, and we do projects with different community partners. And this money can be very beneficial because not only does it take care of some of the preservation and beautification and restoration work in the cemetery, but it can also be used as a direct boost into the endowment care fund. And we do all of those things with the money that we raise throughout each year. So we have events where we do historical tours, and we have a great partnership with Columbus Landmarks Foundation for one. We have one on Sunday. If any of you would like to join, go to Columbus Landmarks webpage and you can sign up for it. To our walking tour. We have bicycle tours that we've been doing the last 2 years with Columbus Outdoor Pursuits in the summertime. We have the Day of the Dead with Latino Arts for the Humanities. And one particularly interesting, I think, to this group is we have our Walk with the Dead 5K with the Rotary. And these events, sometimes, for instance, Latino Arts for the Humanities, we simply host that for them. They are kind of a shoestring group, but they put together this great event, and it raises awareness in the community, and especially in a community that's a growing community in Columbus that we would like to have more heritage established at Greenlawn Cemetery with. Other events like the walks and like the 5K, then we do some profit sharing and we get a cut of that, and we're able to use that to restore monuments, to restore some of our stained glass windows. We've put up some new monuments, for instance, for the folks that were moved from the North Cemetery and had been buried at Greenlawn since the 1880s with no monument. We finally got a monument up for them last year. So we're able to do some great projects. And we also inject an additional tens of thousands of dollars in an average year into our cemetery's endowment care fund, building for that long-term preservation of the cemetery. So these events do really wonderful things for the future of Greenlawn. And we have a lot of these partners. This is some of the bigger ones, but I'm sure I probably forgot a few as I was pasting this together last night. But yeah, we really have had great success on this. Now, it's a cemetery, so there is some question as what's appropriate to do in a cemetery, what's not appropriate to do in a cemetery, and we try to be pretty judicious about that. We wouldn't have a haunted woods, probably not something we would do. We wouldn't do something where everyone was just traipsing across the cemetery. For instance, the Day of the Dead event is mostly held in an open grassy area where there are no burials and on the hard stand. The run, of course, the 5K run is all on the roads. So we try to do things that we think are respectful. There's always different people have different attitudes as to what's appropriate and not appropriate. We always deal with a little bit of that. But by and large, I think we've done a pretty good job over the years, and we certainly have built a lot of community excitement. And that's really what's important for the cemetery as well, because cemeteries that do fall into neglect, cemeteries that do fail, are ones that become forgotten by their community. And by having these people come in and experience Greenlawn, when you come out and participate in the 5K, it's going to be beautiful. The leaves are finally going to start changing. You're going through these beautiful old monuments and around some of Franklin County's original terrain with the rolling glacial topography. And it's just a special place. And people come out, they're excited by that. They want to be there. They want to support the cemetery. It energizes them as customers. It energizes them as donors. And it just energizes them that when Greenlawn needs something or when there's a problem at Greenlawn, we have community support to get it taken care of. And that's the key to keeping the cemetery relevant to the community, especially the younger generation that does not seem to be quite as engaged with great-great-grandparents' time as what perhaps my generation is engaged. And so having these events really reaches out and brings people in, and it's a great strength of the cemetery. And of course, eventually we want to get to that perfect model where we're not touching the endowment, it's just growing and growing, where some of our donations are such that we can put some of them into the endowment. Sales is strong. We're basically supporting the entire model as we do these programs and stay engaged in the community. And in the end, our goal is to have Greenlawn Cemetery around for hundreds and thousands of years, well-maintained, beautiful, continuously improved, and that's certainly a full-time effort when you have a property like Greenlawn. It's a very special park, and it's one that requires a very special effort to keep it that way. I'd be happy to answer any questions about Greenlawn. Yes?
Yes, sir. Thank you for your presentation. Do you have any tours of kind of famous or semi-famous folks that are laid to rest there?
We do, and both self-guided and guided tours. Self-guided, we have a number of pamphlets in our office. Anytime the office is open, you can pick up a map and some of the pamphlets, and they focus certain groups like the Medal of Honor recipients, some of the more notable OSU folks, some of our founding families, some of the more notable members of the Black community, some important women from Columbus history. So they're kind of themed self-guided tours. And then our guided tours, we have a lot of generic tours where we talk kind of always give kind of the basis of the history of Greenlawn, but then we'll vary the theme and we'll vary the route so that we can cover maybe one time. I did one recently where we did Cowboys and Indians of Greenlawn because we have some Native Americans. We also have some folks that fought at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We have a guy that rode with Wyatt Earp. So we did that as a theme. We did another theme where we did heroes and victims and villains of the 1913 flood. We had to stretch a little bit for an actual villain, but we found one that was close. And but yeah, so we do try to highlight those because we have James Thurber, we have Eddie Rickenbacker, we have so much of Columbus's notable folks buried out there, and part of our job is to keep those memories and those stories alive. Yes.
Can you comment about Greenlawn Abbey and those mausoleum? Is it open for visitors and can you take tours of it?
Yeah, I can. So Greenlawn Abbey is a separate property just down the street from us. It's a 1927 public mausoleum, which was pretty innovative in 1927. Unfortunately, it opened in 1927, aimed for high-income customers, and then 1929 happened. So it fell into disrepair. They did not have an endowment established sufficient to maintain it when their business dried up. And a preservation group eventually came together and restored it. It is now open. They have a lot of events and a lot of tours, all of which go towards the preservation of the building. And here within the last year, they've identified they have 100 crypts left, and they also have some glass-fronted niches for cremated remains. And it is possible to actually be buried in Greenlawn Abbey again. And you can inquire at that at the Greenlawn Cemetery office. Even though it's a separate property, the same cemetery operator operates both properties, so the same salespeople do both jobs. So if you're interested, they'd be happy to show you down there. But they do tours. They have a Facebook page that has all their events on it. They have movie nights, all kinds of stuff. Yes?
How long is projected to have space available? How many years?
We think about another 100 years. It's a little tricky to predict because just based on the number of acres that we have left and the rate of burial, you would think maybe 70, 80 years or so. But there's a trend towards cremation, and so that requires less space. And originally, a lot of those cremated remains were not ending up in cemeteries. Now that trend is also changing a little bit because when grandmother dies, then grandkids are like, oh, or when mother dies, the kids find grandmother on the mantle or in the closet, like, oh, well, what should we do? They do want someplace to memorialize her, to put up a stone, to give her a final resting place. So they are coming into cemeteries, but that takes up less space. We have spreading options. We have green tree options. We'll bury your cremated remains with a tree now. In fact, we're doing one of those tomorrow. Our first one, in fact, tomorrow. And so that takes less land. So between that and the tendency to go into mausoleums and build buildings, all of that adds to your lifespan. So we're thinking about 100 years.
Would you take over the old Clipper Stadium? Could you buy that land?
I don't know that we would be able to buy. I mean, it's a big property, and they do have plans for it. So I think we'll wait and see. But I mean, anything that became available, especially that was only lightly developed around the cemetery, we'd have to take a look at because that would expand our life exponentially. We are talking to a couple of property owners right now about smaller lots, not quite that big of a bite, but yeah, that would be wonderful if it ever came about. Yes.
Mr. Rogers, thank you for your presentation. A question regarding maybe a comparison of the operations between Spring Grove in Cincinnati and Greenlawn here to get a better understanding of maintenance costs, long-term plans, how you get to the bottom line.
They're only 3 years older than Greenlawn. Spring Grove is the largest cemetery in Ohio down in Cincinnati. It's also a rural cemetery. Originally had the same landscape architect. After 10 years, they jumped to a different architect down there. But Cincinnati was one of the largest cities in the United States in the early 1800s. Columbus was a small village where we still had stumps around our State House Square, and there were still cows grazing along High Street. So a little different situation between the two cities. So Spring Grove has always been better funded. And you can actually see that because when you look at Greenlawn, it was designed as a rural cemetery in a very natural, primitive sense of using local native trees, not doing a lot of terraforming, using the land as it was. In Cincinnati, the Horticultural Society was involved. They had a lot more money, and so they were able to import exotic trees. They were able to change the landscape and shape it to make it more dramatic. Again, still flowing with that romantic era of the arts, but slightly different visions, and kind of related to the fact that Cincinnati has always had more money in Columbus during the 1800s and early 1900s. So since Spring Grove has done a fantastic job over the years, their endowment proportionately is approximately 4 times what our minimum goal for our endowment would be. They have a massive endowment after 177 years. And very successful, beautiful cemetery, very well maintained, and probably in most regards, they spend a lot more per year than what we do, with the unfortunate exception, we probably spend a lot more in security each year than they do. But it is an interesting comparison because it shows where the differences between the amount of wealth in Cincinnati and Cleveland in the 1800s versus the wealth in Columbus. And after all of this time, it still shows up in our architecture and our cemeteries.
So ColumbusRotary has helped a couple times on tree planting projects. So can you tell about your tree planting goals here and how far along you've come?
Yeah, and we've really come far along. So about 8 years ago, we realized that there was about a 70-year gap where occasionally small efforts had been made to plant trees, but for the most part, this original pre-European settlement, mixed oak forest, had been allowed to just kind of start to fade away as the trees aged out and blew over or fell down or whatever, or were removed, and had not been replaced. And so about 8 years ago, we inventoried, we measured, identified, and mapped every tree in the cemetery, which at that time was over 4,448 trees. And we put them into a database, and we analyzed it. We realized, hey, you know what? After all this time, we still have half the trees are native, and we still have this significant remnant of these native mixed oak trees that are 200 to 300 years old. We need to preserve this for the future. So we launched a 7-year program where we've been planting between 200 and 400 trees per year, covering the entire cemetery, using mostly about 30 different species that you would find in a native mixed oak forest. And we are now in the second half of the 7th year of that program. I've made it to every garden in the cemetery except one. And we've planted thousands of trees, and I haven't even counted them up yet because I'm waiting to do a big presentation on it at the end. But we've moved the needle from being half native to now we're going to be 85% native. We've moved the needle from having 10 trees per acre to about 15 trees per acre, which is what we would have had around the turn of the century. We've planted this next generation of these maples and oaks that will live for 200 to 400 years, and they'll be around now for the next 200 to 400 years without losing that character that makes Greenlawn so special. And we've also added a lot of understory trees, the dogwoods, the redbuds, the buckeyes, the wild black cherries, that will actually make the habitat even better for our birds and our urban wildlife than what it was before, and with more fall color, more diversity of flowers in the spring. So it's been a huge effort, and I think we'll probably have another year or two where we're doing some replacement planting and just some individual projects, a lot less than what we've been doing here lately. And within the next 2 to 3 years, we'll be in a maintenance phase where we lose a tree, we replace it, and we can keep it caught up on. So keeping Greenlawn green has been a big effort. It's been a 7.5-year, 8-year project now, and we're just at the cusp of declaring victory, at least for the moment. Anything else? Well, thanks, and really, thanks for your support and partnership.
All right, with that, we'll call this meeting in order. Thank you all for joining us today.